Hi, welcome to Judson
Conversation with the author from Judson Press. I hope you all doing well today. My name is Cheryl Price. I'm the senior editor at Judson Press. And today our featured author is Dr. Marvin McMickle. I'm sure a lot of you already know him. He's a preacher par excellence, excellent author, writer, teacher, and today we are featuring him with his book, Let the Oppressed Go Free, and it explores various theologies of liberation. So today we welcome a pastor of Antioch Baptist Church for 25 years. He's also serving as the interim pastor. He was a former president of Colgate Rochester Divinity School, the wonderful seminary I attended as well. And he also has a good sense of humor, if you don't know. So thank you, Dr. McMickle, for being with us. And we welcome you to a conversation with the author, Dr. Marvin McMickle.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Cheryl Price. Thank you for several things. First of all, thank you for accepting the position as senior editor at Judson Press.
Thank you.
When you and I first met one another, you were working with Urban Ministries Institute in Chicago with that kind of educational information, and you were doing a great job there. But what a catch you are for Judson Press to have you as a part of their editorial team. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for arranging for today. I'm honored to be able to share this time with you and other Judson Press staff and those who've signed up. And you left one thing out about your Colgate Rochester connection. You're also on the board of trustees. And so on any occasion when the board would convene, there you were, providing the kind of leadership and guidance that was so important for me during my years as president. So thank you for all you do. And I'm anxious to begin today's conversation.
All right, thank you. And I see see your book there that you have that we're going to talk about today. Yes, Let the Oppressed Go Free. Thank you for
Let
sharing.
the Oppressed Go Free just came out this month, and I'm looking forward to it. I must tell you that I've been writing this book for 40 years. Some books come to you very quickly because you know what you want to say. You've done the necessary levels of research, and it's an informational enterprise. You get the facts, you assemble them, you do the chapter organization, and away you go. This is different. This was a very different project. This took me literally all my life to come to this book. It started in my first church, Cosmopolitan Community Church in Chicago. And the Reverend Mary G. Evans, who, by the way, is listed in that wonderful book by Betty Collier Thomas called Daughters in Thunder. I was born and raised under a female preacher. First voice I heard in the pulpit was a woman. And so when in subsequent years, I began to hear people questioning whether or not women could or should be in the ministry, I never got caught on that because of Mary G. Evans. And I've written about her in this book. It was then important for me to reflect on my years at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. I don't know that I would have written this book if I'd gone to another school. Many other schools are just as fine as Union, but they lack one thing that Union had when I was there, and that was James Cone. I went to Union because of James Cone, and this study begins with his influence on my life. And as you know, Cheryl, James Cone and I were not just in relation as teacher and student at Union in the 1970s. He spoke the installation address at my inaugural at Colgate Rochester Crozer. Yes. So that our relationship stretched for 40 years.
Mhm.
And it was instrumental in this book. So that's how I got started from my earliest years with Mary G. Evans up to my installation at Colgate with James Cone.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing the background story to how Let the Oppressed Go Free has become such I think, an insightful book that really shares some deep thoughts and discussions we need to have about liberation and various forms of theology. And one of the questions I had after reading your book is, why do you think so many religious leaders, not just religious leaders, but in general, religious leaders and others don't seem to put to the forefront the concerns and needs of the indigenous people in our country, the native people? We talk about liberation and so forth, but that's not something that always comes to the forefront or top priority. And so I was wondering, based on your book and your experiences, can you share that insights with us about
Yeah,
that?
sure. Well, the treatment of indigenous persons from the northern parts of Canada to the southern part of Chile, and I want to put it in that framework. We think about Native Americans as those who lived within the confines of today's United States. That would be an error. Native Americans and indigenous persons lived in all of the Americas. They lived in all of North America, which means up into Canada and into Alaska. They were resident in all of the Caribbean islands and in Mexico. They were resident in Central America and South America, as we have come to name those locations.
Right.
But they've been pushed to the back in all of our discussions because that was the conscious decision made by both European conquerors and by those who shaped the definition of what it means to be an American by the framers of our own Constitution. It was, in fact, our desire that they not be included. The Constitution said about African Americans, 3/5 of a person, and it said about Native Americans not to be taxed, meaning not to be included, not to be counted. And so we have pushed them into the corners, not only of our country, on these windswept reservations in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, but also into these isolated, frozen tundras in North Dakota and South Dakota and Montana. We put them there on purpose so that we wouldn't have to see what was the first form of brutal oppression, which was our treatment of Native American persons. In the book, I spent a great deal of time talking about Andrew Jackson, who was our nation's 7th president, and of Andrew Jackson's 1830 Indian Removal Act, one of the lowest points in American history, when Andrew Jackson dispatched the United States Army to forcibly remove 7 tribes of Native American persons from the Southeast, from Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Arkansas, and forcibly move them to the west side of the Mississippi River. Why? 1, because he hated Native Americans because they were different. 2, because he wanted to expand slave-holding territory. And 3, so that those states could then become fertile ground for the growing of cotton and other slave labor crops. So from 1830, we have been pushing Native Americans, indigenous persons out of our sight and off of our mind. And we have to work just as consciously, I think, to reawaken within ourselves that really, I think in this country, the worst forms of oppression cannot be described without describing the highest rates of homicide, the highest rates of suicide, the highest rates of poverty, the highest rates of domestic violence, the highest rates of drug addiction and alcoholism, all happen on Native American reservations. And so, yeah, it's very intentional for me to say, I want to quote one of my former doctoral students, Jamie Eddy, who I quote in the book. And I quote her as often as I can because it was a really insightful point that she made in her dissertation. She said, talking about men, that if the only thing that men want is to be liberated from racism, but they're not committed to other forms of liberation, then what they want is not liberation. What they want is privilege. They want to be exempted from oppression, but they're perfectly content to allow other forms of oppression to continue. I think you've got to follow a pattern. As I say in the book, I was driven in large measure to write this book by my own version of the Me Too phrase long before the Me Too movement came along. I'd be sitting in a classroom talking about Black theology and issues of racism, and women would say, yeah, but me too. What about sexism? Or a gay and lesbian student would say, yeah, me too, but what about homophobia? Or foreign students from other countries would say, yeah, but what about imperialism and colonialism? So it was students hearing me out on matters of race, but pushing me to say more and think more about the other forms of oppression that really made the book line up the way it does. And by the way, I must tell you and to the listeners that this is what happened to Jim Cone. And I learned this to some degree by watching women who loved Jim Cone for the way he introduced Black theology, but who said to him, okay, you've done a good job on the matter of race, but what do you want to say to us on the matter of gender?
Right.
And that's really what gave birth, not so much to feminist theology as to womanist theology.
Thank you so much. And we know that we have a lot of listeners and persons who are with us. So I just want to say also thank you to all of our guests who are here. We are going to have time for you to also post your questions. If you haven't, please put them in the chat. And we will save time for Dr. McMickle to address as many questions as possible. Before we move to sharing and having you answer those questions, I'd like for you to spend some time talking about the various theologies that you've explored in the book and to, give us their names as well as a brief overview about each one.
Yes, okay. Let me start by simply saying that I'm not trying to give ideas. I'm not trying to think things up to say. I'm trying to do what Jim Cone was saying should have been done all along. And that is, how can you read the Bible and claim to be a Christian and fail to have seen the number of instances all the way through the Bible where the issue was, it is not enough to be religious in the sense of the rites, R-I-T-E-S, of the church or going through the formalities of religious practice. It's not enough to do that if you are not paying close attention to issues of justice and righteousness. How do you read Exodus? How do you read large portions of Isaiah? How do you read Micah? How do you read Amos? How do you read Jesus? And not realize that they are repeatedly calling us to pay attention to the least of these. Isaiah 58, for instance, is where the people are lamenting to God because they have been fasting, which they think is an appropriate religious ritual in order to please God. And they raise this question, why do we fast? And the Lord does not notice. Why do we deny ourselves? And the Lord does not pat us on the back for doing so. And then Isaiah in the oracle says, well, this is why. Because what you're offering God is not the fast, not the religious practice that God wants. What God wants, and this is where the title of the book comes from, is that you loosen the yoke of the oppressed, that you lift the burdens of those who are downtrodden, that you let the oppressed go free. That language appears again in Isaiah 61. It appears again in Luke 4. So this is a biblical argument This is not an argument that is rooted in any particular point of view that I may have. I'm trying to bear witness to what the scriptures say. The first one, obviously, is the one that I was introduced first, which is Black theology, which is based upon the premise that God is committed to the liberation of persons who are facing oppression because of race and historic racism, both singular racism and also systematic racism. And we have to keep fighting on that front because white supremacy is as much with us today as it was in 1619. So the first form of let the oppressed go free are those whose oppression is the result of their race or their ethnicity. That's where James Cone started. At the same time that he was writing, in fact, even a few years earlier, as far back as the 1950s, but really in the 1960s, in Latin America, an additional form of liberation theology was emerging. Your listeners may know the name of Gustavo Gutierrez and his 1971 book, A Theology of Liberation, where he was saying the issue of oppression for them who? Mexico, Central America, South America. The driving issue is the issue of poverty. Now, the poverty is in a very real sense also in relationship, in many cases, to their ethnicity. But it's the way in which European explorers and then much later international corporations, including the ones in this country, were systematically and intentionally robbing those continents, Central America, South America, of their resources, paying almost slave labor to their human resources, and leaving people in a tremendous wealth disparity that was reinforced in many instances by governments and by the use of militia that would sort of terrorize the neighborhood. So the second form of oppression was poverty. I do a chapter as well on the intersection of race and poverty in the United States. Mm-hmm. I then go on to begin to discuss the issue of gender, beginning with feminist theology. Now, it just so happens, here again is my Union seminary experience. I was a classmate of a woman named Carter Haywood. Carter was one of the women who were ordained in what was called an unapproved ordination by the Episcopal Church in Philadelphia in 1975. This was before the Episcopal Church recognized women as priests. If I had not been at Union, I would not have known Carter. I would not really have had a front row seat to that debate. Mm-hmm. But while I am aware of the struggles of women for ordination, I was also there at the time when the whole question of inclusive language was being debated. So the question of feminism is both inclusivity in language, but also inclusivity in terms of leadership, ordination, being able to have your call honored and recognized.
Right.
But then I go from feminist theology, which is just gender in general, to womanist theology. Yeah. Which is really where people like Katie Cannon and others were raising the question of this strange intersection between race, poverty, and class. Right. I mean, race, poverty, and gender. Black women who in many instances were living on sort of poverty level income, raising children by themselves. And what does it look like and feel like to be a Black woman in poverty, striving to be recognized in your own church? My mother was on a search committee for her church in Chicago, Park Manor Christian Church, 73rd and St. Lawrence, the church where we moved after we left Cosmopolitan. And they were asking the question in this all-Black church of whether or not they should give any consideration to female applicants. And one day I asked her how the search was going, and she just almost broke into tears. And I said, what in the world? What's the matter? And she said, I just want to tell you what someone on the search committee said without being challenged by any other male. He said, I would rather have the least qualified man than the most qualified woman.
Yeah.
Now, how do we look at African-American women in our churches if we've got people in the pews who think that that's the norm? So what womanist theology tries to do is force us to deal with this intersection of race, they're Black, of class, this a matter of poverty or at least lower income capacity, and gender. I superimpose on the discussion of womanist theology, Paul in Galatians 3:26 and 29, in Christ there's neither male nor female, gender, neither slave nor free, class, neither Jew nor Gentile, ethnicity. So, womanist theology. Then go on to, I think, where a considerable number of readers will need to pause. Not because they don't agree, it's just they've never really been forced to think about what is called queer theology or LGBTQ theology, which is to ask the question, is there room in the church at two levels? Is there room in the church for open membership? And is there room in the church for open leadership, meaning to be ordained and to be allowed to function within the ministry because God has laid a call upon their lives? Is there room in the church for persons within the LGBTQ community? Now, most of my life, as I was growing up in Chicago, this was simply not a matter of discussion. We all knew there were persons who were in the LGBTQ community, but we didn't think about it theologically. They were either your friends and you moved on, or you had some pre-existing notion there was something sort of biologically wrong about that, and so you would shun them. You just would not engage with them, and you have to find your way within that spectrum. This book wants to force people to ask the question: is there room in your church, and is there room in your pulpit for persons who reside as self-declared persons within the LGBTQ community? Now, I take on directly Leviticus 18:22 and Romans 1:24 and 25. Because these are the verses that folks who are opposed to this topic will turn to in words of judgment and condemnation. Okay, I'm going to concede for one moment that that's where they want to stand. Let's just concede that so I can press this case. How much of Leviticus do you want to hold up as the norm in 21st century America? And how much of Romans 1 do you want to take on? Because after Paul talks about a man with a man and a woman with a woman, that God gave them over to those things. Well, Paul doesn't stop. We do, but Paul doesn't stop.
Right.
He goes on to talk about murder and envy and greed and jealousy and the creating of schisms. Leviticus isn't just about Leviticus 18:22. Surprising. There are people who go to Red Lobster, eat shrimp, wearing a suit made of silk and wool, and talk negatively about gay and lesbian persons when all of that is in Leviticus. But of course, they overlook the things they don't want to pay attention to, and they just zero in on the words of judgment. So the book wants us to hear. There are authors that I have referenced who are telling their own story about why it is they are saying to the church, me too. My obligation is to give voice to those who are saying on the issue of LGBTQ issues, me too. Don't leave us out of the discussion. Do not say that you want to let the oppressed go free while you are actively participating in the oppression of other people based upon standards that you have self-selected, leaving other materials out because they are inconvenient. Then the last one, and we just discussed it, is Native American sovereignty theology. Now, this is really interesting, Cheryl, because it includes Native Americans reflecting on their own experiences with Christianity. And the fact that in many instances, Christianity was not for them a liberating experience. In too many cases, Christianity was involved in the attempt to forcibly turn them away from their own traditional religious practices and their own worldviews, their own eschatology, their own cosmology, their own sense of how the world is ordered. We think in terms of a linear sense of history. They have much more of a sense of the cyclical nature of history. We think about individual life and individual achievement. They think far more about what is good for the group. And I list in the book just a long line of encounters between American society and Native American populations where there was only one thing on America's mind: extermination. I talk about the fact that the same George Armstrong Custer that we celebrate, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn and the destruction of a portion of the 7th Cavalry, the same George Armstrong Custer led another attack on an Indian village called Washita at the banks of a Washita River, where they literally killed to the last old man, woman, and child every Native American Cheyenne in that village. And you wonder why at the Battle of the Little Bighorn there was such ferocity on the part of the Native Americans with that encounter with Custer. And the answer was they had a good memory of what had happened at Washita. And they were tired of being forced farther and farther from their natural lands. So to think about the Native American theology of liberation is not just to think about their sense of Christianity, but to resurrect, kind of in a post-colonial point of view, to resurrect their own worldview, their own sense of time and history, which has been shattered by these forced removals. Now, there are, of course, Native Americans who do not live on reservations. They are members of our churches. I recall doing a wedding for a Native American couple. It was one of the most beautiful things that my wife and I ever observed. The bride put a blanket or a shawl or something, and she was standing on it so that she was sort of standing on her tradition. And then when it came time for the Lord's Prayer, she signed with Indian signs. She signed the Lord's Prayer. The groom was dressed in the traditional garb of his own particular tribal background. So there are people who are straddling the world of the Native American culture and tradition and contemporary Christianity. But I want to honor them as the first people before the transatlantic slave trade began in earnest, when the first Europeans settled here, when they came to what is now the Dominican Republic. There were, by some estimates, between northern Canada and southern Chile, about 100 million Native Americans. By the time smallpox and other diseases for which they had no immunity, and forced labor and outright genocide was through, that population had been reduced by 90%. I don't want any African American to think that they have a corner on the market of suffering until they've heard Native Americans say, "Me too."
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to just remind everyone, if you don't have your copy, please, you can purchase a copy at judsonpress.com or where any other really good books are sold. We want to just make sure that you take time to decide if you also want to share Dr. McMickle's book, Let the Oppressed Go Free, with friends, with other professors and other seminarian students. Take a moment and just think about who else you can share this wonderful book with that has so many ways to look at liberation and to look at oppression. He's already shared how sometimes we don't always put at the forefront our persons who are with us in this land, who are part of the land, the native people of this land, and how that gets put to the back. And also his ideas of and his thoughts on liberation theology based on womanist theology, feminist theology, and other movements. So we want to make sure that you share this wonderful book again with other persons, this book of liberation, this book that really starts to dismantle oppression in other ways. And we know that we have some guests who have some questions, but before we do this, I have one other question I'd like to ask you, Dr. McMickle, and then we'll open it up to our guests who are here as well, too. Do you agree or do you disagree with the Western belief of individualism and how it contributes to the oppression in this country?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there is within certain sectors of our country a preoccupation with individual achievement, and we value ourselves based upon what we singularly have achieved, the titles that we have garnered for ourselves, the degrees that we have for ourselves, sort of the pull yourself up by your own bootstraps thinking in the world. Of course, even the ones who claim individual achievement have knowingly or unknowingly achieved at the expense of those, number one, who are not allowed to participate in the process. So if you say, I achieved a certain thing within my profession, the highest rank or the highest level, but of course I disqualified 35 to 40% of the population that could have competed against me for this title. It's like what happened with Major League Baseball just recently when they decided finally, after all of these years, to recognize the achievements of the athletes who were in the old Negro leagues. So now comes the question. Babe Ruth was the home run king until Hank Aaron came along. Well, okay, how much longer would he have been the home run king with his record in the 1920s if Josh Gibson had been allowed to be included in the count? So yeah, individual achievement is always in relationship to who's the pool against which you have to compete. Mm-hmm. I think in other parts of the world, and this is really true for the Native American, but I think it's also true for many African cultures as well, there's just a stronger sense that I am no stronger than we are. There's a real strong sense of the community, which if we lose, looking out for one another, advocating for one another, the sense that nobody should be hungry if somebody has some food. Nobody should be poor if somebody has some money. Our own personal stewardship is an indication of whether or not our checkbook looks as if every dime and dollar that we have, we spend on ourselves, or if a significant portion of our resources are being directed toward the benefit of other persons. So yeah, I think Western individualism, first of all, is a frayed and flawed concept because nobody gets where they are by themselves. We are all the beneficiaries of the efforts of those who've come before us to make a place for us. But I think there is within Native American theology and with African American history, really strong sense of I'm going to go to Chicago from Mississippi. I'm going to prepare a way. I'm going to send for you to come and join us. Mm-hmm. When I was growing up in Chicago, I'm going to guess that 50% of the people in my neighborhood were born in another state, and they were brought up by relatives, brought up by loved ones, sharing housing, sharing resources. I hope we don't lose that. I hope we don't let the I, the letter I, the pronoun I, cause us to lose sight of the we and the us, because I know how I got where I am. I know that I am the beneficiary of something really, really precious. I told a group of my doctoral students some years ago, and there could be a few of them on the line now, so I hope they don't mind my sharing our little secret. But I told them about a story of when I was a freshman, first year student at Union in New York. And 4 of us went to visit Gardner Taylor at Concord Baptist Church for an evening communion. Why would Gardner Taylor at this great church have his communion at night? Why not say, we're going to have it at 11 o'clock, come if you can. That's it. Why? Well, because many people in his church were domestic workers. They worked in the homes of other families. They were not free at 11. They weren't off until 2. This gave them a chance to go home, have dinner, get dressed, come to church at 6 p.m. for communion. So we went. We sat in the back. We wore no name tag. We signed no guest book. This is an immense sanctuary. The lights were dim. There was no way in the world anybody could know that we were there. Until he said, the Holy Spirit has revealed to me that there are four seminarians here. He didn't say from what seminary. 4 seminarians, and I want them to come to my office at the end of the service. Well, I just knew he didn't mean us, because how could he know? But somebody said, just to be sure, the Lord doesn't make mistakes. Let's go back and see if it's us. If it's not, he can tell us, no, it wasn't you. How would he know? I don't know. So we went. He opened the door. He said, are you the 4 seminarians from Union? Well, now this is getting pretty close to us. I said, yes, sir. We are from Union. We are 4 of us. He said, come on in. He asked us how we were doing, how our work was going. Then he said, I know you're hungry because they don't serve dinner at Union on Sunday night. So he reached into his breast pocket. He carried a billfold in his left breast pocket. He took out 4 $10 bills. And he gave one of those $10 bills to each one of us and told us where to go to get the most out of that $10 in Brooklyn. Great. And he called ahead and he told the restaurant owner that we were coming. There were 4 of us from Union. And when we got there, take care of us like they would take care of him. Then he said, I don't want you to ever feel that you have to come back and repay me for this. What I really want you to do is every chance you get for as long as you live, pass this $10 on to somebody else as a reminder of what has already been passed on to you. Right. So I wrote this book, passing on that $10 bill from him, passing on that $10 bill from James Cone, passing on that $10 bill from Lawrence Jones, passing on that $10 bill from C. Eric Lincoln, passing on that $10 bill from Katie Cannon, passing on that $10 bill from Mary G. Evans. That's the gift of African-American community. We pass on to others what others have first passed on to us.
Thank you for sharing. That's an excellent story. Hopefully we will all continue to pass on what we have to share with others as well too. And I know we have some questions that we want to, for you to respond to that are in the chat, and that some of our workers from Judson Press will share. And so you'll have at least 20 minutes or so, we'll have time to answer the questions, to hear the questions and answer them. So we can start sharing the questions now. Thank you.
The first question is from Laura Alden. The church has sometimes been the oppressor, as you mentioned. LGBTQ still seems to be very difficult for us. How will moving forward through this issue of, how will we move forward through this issue of inclusion?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Laura. She is the publisher of Judson Press, and I'm grateful to her for her support over the years with all of the books I've done with Judson. Courage. Courage. Churches have to have the courage to proceed. Pastors have to have the courage to introduce persons to the community who come out of that community of believers. Accurate and thorough biblical exegesis, so that we do not let people slip and slide on Leviticus 18:22 and Romans chapter 1. I was in a conversation, which I report in the book, at a meeting of American Baptist churches. It was not the biennial. It was another meeting, and I ran across a person who was just vehemently opposed to any latitude as regards gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender person. Just relentlessly hostile to the idea, and quoted from 1 Corinthians 6, I think it was, that no unholy, no unclean person will get into heaven. And of course, she was focusing in, I've given it at least that much away, was a she, that the LGBT community practices unholiness. I said, well, what are the other unholy things in 1 Corinthians 6 that you want to say in your next sermon will keep people out of heaven? Or are you just going to eisegete this text?
Right.
And just focus in on the one thing that you do not practice yourself?
Mm-hmm.
What are you going to say about all the other things in that passage that you ought not let slide? So I think we have to hold people to a higher standard of exegesis. Listen, people use the same Bible to justify slavery. We had the courage to defy that and to reread those scriptures and let the oppressed go free. They use the same Bible to justify the marginalization of women in 1 Timothy and in 1 Corinthians. Same Bible. As Demetrius Williams says, you cannot use the same Bible to argue against racism and argue for sexism. I think we just have to take the next step. It's a new step for most of the church. Most people that I know are not hostile to the idea. They just never really have been engaged in a theological discussion about it. I know and have known all my life persons who are in the LGBT community, even in my own family. I have not, spent 1 second debating whether or not they were or were not going to go to heaven. But that's because, in part, they had not yet raised the Me Too comment. What's forced me into this is that people who are impacted by this are forcing the church to say, Me Too. And then answer the question, why is it that we are reluctant? What is it about that group that makes us less inclined to say, yeah, you can be ordained, you can get married, you can see your loved one in the hospital, you have the same rights? And by the way, why is the federal government ahead of the church on the issue of compassion? Why do we have laws in federal and state statutes that make discrimination based upon sexual orientation a crime? But we can't get the church to be ahead of the state. We ought to be leading on this question. We ought to be saying that all of these persons are children of God. Now, if you say, I don't affirm their behavior, listen, think of all the behaviors you could name that you might not affirm. Are you as outspoken about all the other things you don't like as you are about this? But in saying something, you expose yourself and your sympathies to the feedback and the pushback and the criticism. So I want to give you a Greek word that many of my students over the years have heard me use. And the Greek word is parrhesia. Perhaps you can type it for me into the chat box, Parrhesia. H-E-S-I-A, parrhesia. It's found in Acts chapter 4. It's also found in the writings concerning Socrates. Parrhesia means bold speech without regard for any consequences to the speaker. Bold speech that is not muffled because the speaker is afraid that if he or she says this, there may be a negative consequence. As long as the pulpit is driven by people who are more concerned about the feedback than they are about the proclamation of the truth of the gospel, we will make no progress in this area. So I invite those who are prepared to do so to engage in a little parrhesia.
Well, thank you. Courage, parrhesia. Thank you. Next question. We appreciate that. Don't forget courage, parrhesia. Another question, please.
Okay. Next question is from Kevin Slayton. While this book has been in you for years, how did the America you've experienced the last 4 years impact your final outcome?
Thank you, Dr. Slayton. That's one of our recent DMin graduate students from Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School down in Baltimore, and doing a great job down in Baltimore. I think the last 4 years of, I'm just going to say 45. You know who I mean by 45.
Yes.
And the last 4 years of the MAGA movement, Make America Great Again, which has given birth to QAnon, given birth, or at least given space to Proud Boys, given birth and space to Oath Keepers, given birth and space to Nazi sympathizers, given birth and space to there being very fine people on both sides, has made me more keenly aware that if at any point I might have thought that America was a post-racial society, that we most certainly are not. The last 4 years have reminded me that racism and white supremacy are etched into the consciousness of this country. And it is something against which we must persistently and continually rebel. Now remember that when Donald Trump, 45, was honoring a group of Navajo Indians for their role in World War II, engaging in what was called wind talking, where they were communicating instructions. These were Marines, US Marines, in the Pacific during World War II. They were sending instructions back and forth from one place to the other using the Navajo language. They were called code talkers. And the Japanese could not interpret what was going on. And so they were a valuable asset. By the way, Native Americans have fought in every war, as have African Americans, in every war fought by this country since the Revolutionary War. When he chose to honor them in the East Room of the White House, he did so while standing under a photograph or picture or painting of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, Indian Removal Act. You picked that place to stand to honor Native Americans who fought in a war after you got 5 draft deferments. And in that same presentation, referred to Elizabeth Warren as Pocahontas. This is a man who has engaged in all manner of sexual abuse. This is a man who, sort of embodies everything that liberation theology is against. And he has infected the nation with this toxicity. So that in point of fact, if I wasn't going to write this book before, I had to really bring it out now because even though Trump is gone, Trumpism is alive and well. Trumpism was on display at the US Capitol on January the 6th. And brace yourself, Trumpism is coming this coming Sunday when he gives the talk at the CPAC, Conservative Political Action Committee. So I think we need to read this book in order to brace ourselves to refute their view of America, which is essentially, I often use these two words interchangeably, justice and just us. Their sense of justice extends only to just us. And these last 4 years have been dangerous for the work of justice in a country where only white supremacists think they ought to have voice. I mean, why do we have the first thing that happened after the last election was state after state after state instituting voter suppression rules? I want to keep those people from voting because we don't want those people picking our leadership. No, thank you, Kevin. These last 4 years have been instrumental in increasing my level of fury.
Yes. Thank you for that response and a reminder that justice, we must advocate strong for justice because we know that not having justice and justism is just leaves us just too far behind and so many people are suffering. So that is clear that liberation and oppression from oppression must happen. Do you have another question?
Yes, Jackie Sullivan asked, I have had struggles with George Custer being in the Union and helping free slaves, but also wanting to destroy the Native Americans. Hero or villain?
George Armstrong Custer, like many American military leaders, was heroic to the extent that they helped to save the Union. Not necessarily because they cared one iota about the end of slavery. Now, if you had said to me, William Tecumseh Sherman, I would say, okay, now here was a general who went out of his way to pass executive field orders to establish space and rights and protections for freed slaves, 40 acres and a mule. That was William Tecumseh Sherman. George Armstrong Custer is celebrated because he led the Michigan brigades in a fight at Hanover to preserve the Union. His true colors come out in the fact that there were not, to my knowledge, any African Americans in the 7th Cavalry. If there were, they were quartermasters and cooks. There's no celebration of African Americans in terms of their contribution to anything that George Armstrong Custer did. And so when that Civil War battle was over, off he goes, perhaps on assignment, to clear the way for settlers moving west. Theoretically, there were treaties that were supposed to protect certain lands of Native Americans until the rumor, not even the certainty, the rumor of gold was announced in the Black Hills of Montana. And then here came the settlers rushing for individual gain, despite Native American treaties. By the way, at the Washita River, there were treaty protections for that group that the soldiers violated. They did it again at the Little Bighorn. No, I think that George Armstrong Custer is a military hero for those who keep track of such things because of his fight to protect the Union. Bear in mind, Lincoln's plan in protecting the Union and for freeing the slaves was never that the slaves would stay as free persons in this country. If you've been watching this series on Lincoln that's been on CNN, Divided We Stand, it's pretty clear that Lincoln really wanted to see people of color colonized outside of this country. Mm-hmm. So I would say, villain, hero, yeah, he certainly was not on the side of anybody of color to the extent that he was prepared to view them or see them as his social or political equal. I think he was a person of his time. I would simply introduce William Tecumseh's sermon as a different model of somebody who, having fought the war and freed the slaves, then used his power and influence to protect them, which lasted until 1877 and the Compromise of 1877, when the Union soldiers positioned there by Sherman were then withdrawn. And that was the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the end of the rights and liberties of those persons.
Thank you. And our time is drawing near, but hopefully we have time for one more question. Gail, is there another question? Because then I'll.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was talking and you couldn't hear me.
Oh, okay.
Sierra Cates asks, what are some ways you've been able to spur buy-in commitment to LGBTQ plus and indigenous liberation from the Black community, given the history of negligence and focus on Black suffering?
What was the first question? What is the way by which I have been able to
spur buy-in commitment?
Yeah. I think what one has to do is what Jamie Eddy said. What one has to follow the voices who are saying me too. I don't have the right to exclude anybody that I firmly believe God has included. There are people who are still arguing against me on the basis of race. There are people who are still arguing against Cheryl on the basis of gender.
Right.
I don't have the right to argue for the end of my oppression, but turn a deaf ear to those who are saying we are suffering perhaps a triple, even a quadruple form of oppression. We are Black. We are either a lesbian or a transgender person. We're living in poverty. We're aspiring to be recognized in our own community, and nobody is making any room for us. So I'm buying in with them because I want other folks to buy in on me and on Cheryl and on Native Americans. I don't want to leave anybody out in the quest for liberation. And I want to talk face to face with people who want to use the Bible as the basis for their exclusion of LGBTQ people. I want you to put your verse up and let me read what your verse is so I can throw about 60,000 other verses at you, because I don't want you to walk away from here thinking that because you quoted Leviticus 18:22, you have closed the discussion. You've only demonstrated how little of the Bible you know and of how little liberation you really want.
All right, thank you so much. Well, we have time maybe for, is there time for one more question with a brief response from our guests? As we remember, go to judsonpress.com and other places to purchase the book, Let the Oppressed Go Free. Gail, is there time for one more question or thought?
Dr. Dinatha Gilmore, I think it is. Dr. McMickle, we are what we have been taught in the church, where most of our values and worldviews were established. Thus, our views on LGBTQ. There are no concerns about loving all. However, how do we allow those individuals in the pulpit who openly confess unrighteousness and have no desire to stop such? Sure, we all sin. However, to know and to continue in such is an affront to living God we serve.
Yes, Dianthea Gilmore. She is here in Cleveland and graduate of Ashland Theological Seminary. I think we're going to have to do the following. We're going to have to impose whatever sense we have of unrighteousness or uncleanness or sinful conduct uniformly. if there are people based upon one behavior who continue in it that we exclude, then the same pattern has to persist with people who continue in adultery or continue in alcoholism or continue in racism or continue in all of the other things that Scripture is clearly about. This is just the one that is newest to us. This is the one that we're going to have to struggle with the most because it is the one that we are encountering most recently. Now, let me tell you what will melt most people's hearts. I know people who were rigidly opposed to homosexuality in principle and in context until a son or a daughter or a brother or a sister or a lifelong friend put a human face on it and said, well, you're talking about me now, and you've just consigned me to hell. And I want to just give you a moment to pause and ask yourself if that's really what you want to do. And I've seen people turn on a dime when it ceased to be a theory or a concept or a text and became a dear and loved human life. Now, I'm not prepared to say that everybody in the church is going to buy into this right away, any more than I think everybody in the church has already bought into the end of racism or the end of sexism or the end of their own contribution to the problems of poverty. This is going to be a process. And some folks will come along and some folks may not ever come along. This is life. I'm suggesting to you where I think the Spirit is leading and where this book is trying to direct us. And I hope and pray that people will open their hearts to that leadership and perhaps discover that there are people in your life who are already members of that community. And as you turn your back on them, you are turning your back on part of God's family.
Thank you, Dr. McMickle. Thank you for all of our guests who joined us today on our conversation featured from Judson Press with our author. Our featured author again, Dr. Marvin McMickle. He's the author of Let the Oppressed Go Free, Exploring Various Liberation Theologies. Again, thank you, Dr. McMickle. Thank you all who have joined us. Thank you for your questions. And we take a moment and think about the liberation. Think about oppression, what you've experienced, what our world has experienced. And let us remember to go forth and do what we need to do to let the oppressed go free. Again, purchase at judsonpress.com or other good books are sold. Let the Oppressed Go Free by Dr. Marvin McMickle. Again, thank you for joining us. And thank you, Dr. McMickle.
Thank you, Cheryl.
All right. God bless. Thank you all.